Hello. On the website of the Land Value Taxation campaign, there's this leaflet. It's an A5 booklet, so it's 4 sides, which explains as much as can be said about land value taxation in a small space. So it's very condensed. This is the second part of the series which I want to make, which will explain the thing in more detail. So we now come to the advantages. The first advantage on the list is described as a natural source of public revenue. All land makes its full contribution to the exchequer, allowing reductions in existing taxes on labour and enterprise. I've thought about this more. It's not as clear as it seemed when the group of us wrote it. The first question is, why do we need government at all? We take it for granted that we've got to have them. Do we though? They didn't have a government in the Garden of Eden, which I think says it all really. We're not in the Garden of Eden, and so we need a government. And also from Scripture there's this. When the children of Israel first entered the Promised Land, they were ruled by judges. The first of them was the successor to Moses, that was Joshua. And that continued for a few hundred years. And eventually they got to Samuel, and he was a wise judge, and he had a couple of sons who were likely to succeed him. And the people thought they were bad eggs. And so we read this in chapter 8 of the first book of Samuel. Then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together and came to Samuel, and said unto him, Now make us a king to judge us like all the others. And Samuel gave them a warning. He said, This will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons to be soldiers, and daughters to be servants, and your fields and vineyards, and men servants, and maid servants, and your goodliest young men, and your asses, and put them to work. And then he went and prayed about it, and he gave in to their request. And then the first king was Saul, who wasn't much good either, and then came David, and then came Solomon, who was a wastrel, though he built the temple, and after that the sons quarrelled, and eventually the whole thing fell apart, as happens. So we need a government as, at best, a necessary evil. What then are the core functions of a government? I'd suggest that at the top of the list comes making land available for the people. I know that sounds a bit highfalutin. What does it mean in practice? It means, for example, that the farmer can plant his seeds and he's safe in the knowledge that he'll be able to reap the crop. It doesn't always happen. There's someone I know in the town has got an allotment, but she never gets to see the crop because people come along and steal it. So that's the function of government, is to enable people to plant their crops, let them grow on and harvest them. It's an essential function of government. The idea of planting crops on land and being able to harvest them was a source of conflict from the earliest times. It's the story of Cain and Abel. Cain didn't want Abel's herds trampling all over his nicely planted fields. You can see the source of the conflict there. So it's a very ancient and primeval source of dispute among people. So that's number one core function of the government, make land available for the people. And the first thing they have to do is to defend the realm from enemies. And nowadays that needs armies and navies and air forces and ships and tanks. So they seem to be getting rid of those now, perhaps. Battleships, submarines, all that kind of stuff. Defending the realm. And then you need to defend the landowner's occupancy. You need a court of law. You don't want to have squatters taking over your land. So we have courts and law enforcement. And then to make the land usable, we also need things like roads and flood defences, all the stuff that government provides. We expect it. They're core functions. Not even the most extreme libertarians would dispute that, I think. This idea of going into a homestead and settling down and growing stuff and being self-sufficient doesn't hold up. The American homesteaders ultimately had the United States Army to defend their rights from marauders. The advocates of homesteading and a kind of anarchical system gloss over that rather important point. If you're going to have government, you're going to have taxes somehow or other. It's all got to be paid for. I'm going to introduce here a theory of money. It's not the only possible theory, but I think it's a useful way of thinking about money. Governments create money. Here's something else from the Bible about the coin that had the image of Caesar on it. And the reason it had the image of Caesar on it was because the government wanted to make sure that it was paid properly. So it demanded that it would be paid in proper money, and proper money was the money with the Caesar's head on it. Here's a British 2-shilling piece from 1889. It's solid silver, but even then it must have been worth less than its face value. So it was a fiat currency of sorts. And then at that time there were sovereigns circulated in gold, and they too would have been worth less than their face value. The mint had to make a profit. Here's some more money. This is the Swedish 200 krona with a picture of Ingmar Bergman on the front. And there's these strange rock formations in the island of Gotland in the Baltic. That's Swedish money. Here's a Danish note. Here's a five lats coin from Latvia. It was worth about £5 in 2010, but it was replaced by the euro, so I don't think I could even get anything from it if I took it into a bank, so that's a collector's item. Here's the very nice looking £2 coin from Britain. I don't seem to have any British notes at the moment. I checked in my wallet. Here are some euro notes, a 20 and a 10, with very nice illustrations of architectural themes. One's got a Gothic window, another one's got a Romanesque doorway. Very attractive design they are. But there's a key problem with the euro, is that they're not issued by a government, which is a very unusual state of affairs. Can it last? Not going to answer that question now. So here's the cycle. The government creates money. The created money is spent to cover expenses. That expenditure mainly creates and sustains land value, and to complete the cycle, land value would have to be collected through the tax system, but it isn't. What sort of tax system should we have? Here, Adam Smith is a good source. You don't have to accept everything he says, but he's very good on tax, surprisingly so. He wasn't perhaps as explicit as he might have been, because he was the protege of the Duke of Buccleuch, who owns a very large tract of southern Scotland. So you have to mind his P's and Q's, I guess. Adam Smith said this. The chapter on tax is called "Of the Sources of the General or Public Revenue of the Society." Just note this part that's highlighted. The private revenue of individuals, it has been shown in the first book of this inquiry, arises ultimately from 3 different sources: rent, profit, and wages. Every tax must finally be paid from some one or other of those 3 different sorts of revenue, or from all of them indifferently. Smith makes a distinction which is no longer made. Rent is in a separate category from profits. Nowadays, rent is rolled into the same category as profits, which doesn't help understanding of what's going on. And then Smith goes on to talk about the 4 canons of taxation, and the canon number 1 is relevant here. He notes, in relation to what I just said, every tax, it must be observed once for all, which falls finally upon one only of the 3 sorts of revenue above mentioned, is necessarily unequal insofar as it does not affect the other 2. Smith seems not to have picked up what the physiocrats noted, which was that all taxes are ultimately at the expense of land rent, but never mind. The subjects of every state ought to contribute towards the support of the government as nearly as possible in proportion to their respective abilities. That is, in proportion to the revenue which they respectively enjoy under the protection of the state. And as we've seen, that revenue which is enjoyed under the protection of the state is nothing other than the rent of land, because the primary function of the state is to make land available and protect people's rights to the use of the land. The expense of government to the individuals of a great nation is like the expense of management to the joint tenants of a great estate, who are all obliged to contribute in proportion to their respective interests in the estate. This is a very clear argument for land value taxation. Let's return now to our original claim that it's a natural source of revenue. A tax on land values, the rental value of land, completes the money cycle, and it ensures that all land makes its full contribution to the exchequer. And of course, if land is taxed heavily, taxes on profits and labour, profits and wages that is, can be reduced or indeed almost eliminated.